Framo, a buzzword among the consultants and vendors. I know.
Uh-oh.
And money laundering is actually an intricate web that never stands alone. Rather, it is invariably woven into the fabric of an underlying criminal act, a term we often refer to as predicate crime. And Nigel, I know you have just recorded a video on predicate crime, correct? And in recent times, the pressing issue of fraud and scams have transcended borders to become a paramount global concern. What has become increasingly apparent is the intersection of fraud and money laundering, where these two nefarious activities converge, compounding the challenges that we face. The landscape of threats is in constant state of flux, evolving and adapting to circumvent existing defenses. So have you, asking the OCC now, have you also observed this trend between fraud and money laundering? And, what can we do to cultivate a culture of perpetual learning and adaptability? What are the strategies?
Well, I think it's important to remember that I think it was Rowan Bosworth Davis who said in the early 1990s that in every money laundering case, there is a fraud. Now, if we work out what a fraud is a lie. It is telling somebody an untruth with the objective of receiving a gain as a result. That's what turns being a liar into being a fraudster. It's the expectation of gain. So every money laundering scheme includes at least one lie. And that one lie is, this is my money and I'm entitled to do what I want with it. Now, there may be many more as to identity or as to sort of the source of the money or all kinds of things. But the single most important lie is, it's my money and I can do what I want. But then the question of fraud is much, much bigger than money laundering. Fraud itself is everything from the dating scams that we see on the news almost daily, down to the idea of somebody advertising a product for sale and not delivering it. That was incredibly popular, so to speak, during the pandemic. And even people who turn up on the doorsteps of little old ladies and say, you've got a hole in your roof, I can fix it.
Yeah.
So the range of fraud is pretty much only limited by the imagination of humans, and there's a lot of humans to imagine stuff. Can we identify fraud? Sometimes, but often not until after it's happened. I mean, we say that a lot of victims of fraud are stupid or greedy, and quite a lot are, to be fair. But many victims of fraud are taken in because the essence of fraud is the old term confidence trick. So it is getting a person to believe you when you are telling them that lie, so they can get it, so they can make a benefit. That's what we have to get people to understand. We're living in a world where, on the one hand, we're being told don't be cynical, but on the other hand, we're saying protect yourself against fraud. Well, you can't protect yourself against fraud if you're not cynical. Mark?
I think I prefer skeptical to cynical as a word. That's just me being picky. The fight against fraud is continuing, and in the UK government gave up fighting fraud 20 years ago. They scrapped the local fraud squads. They scrapped actually responding to people being ripped off. The banks became responsible for refunding frauds, and they've let technologies dominate communication, which has led to that charmingly named pig butchering style fraud. All these sorts of things where, because the subjects are human, they feel more, how can I put this, loyalty to the fraudsters, so that when the police are brought in by banks who've spent millions identifying what fraudulent payments may look like, the police go to clients and clients go, no, it's not a fraud. And they're so embarrassed and they're so emotionally invested in the fraud that they carry on making the payments. I don't think banks and fintechs will be able to fight fraud without government seriously addressing it. And they will not, because it takes time and money. So I'm afraid in the UK, I'm very cynical. You're going to get lots of good statements. You're going to get lots of public sector, value statements, and they will do nothing, because that takes real work, and they can't be bothered. Des, I hope you have a slightly more optimistic view than me.
Really? Optimistic? Well, I guess bearing in mind all of us that have kind of worked in the financial services industry know that fraud is almost a separate department to the compliance and AML teams, and that creates, even within the banks, a separation that is really, really difficult for these businesses. Fraud in many financial institutions is looking at the financial loss, and the fraud departments are quite often judged by how much was lost to fraud against revenue on a percentage basis over a financial year. So therefore, fraud departments will turn around and say, well, we kept our fraud losses below 2% of the total value transactions run during a year. Now, the problem is, while fraud, yes, is a predicate crime offence for money laundering, you've now got a fraud department, but they stop, the fraud department stop if they've managed to either stop the fraud, identify the fraud, or whatever. What we really need to see is a collaboration between the two departments. The fraud departments often end up reporting to the operational risk side of the business, and the AML department report to the compliance side of the business. Whereas wherever I've worked in businesses, I've tried to make compliance would be a horizontal across all business lines, rather than the horizontal, which is the operational risk, and putting fraud within that. So therefore, I can give you a couple of examples, for instance, but I know that straight away, fraud systems, maybe a different transaction monitoring software system, case management system, than there is from a money laundering system. What I've also tried to do in the past is to have some sort of monthly collaboration, and it's only worked in some companies that were able to embrace the idea of having a monthly meeting between the heads of the fraud operational risk team and the heads of the compliance teams, and review the alerts that have come from AML and fraud alerts generated by the transaction monitoring systems. At least then you can quite honestly say you've looked at that. Sorry, yes, Nigel?
Is this because of the difference in the backgrounds of people in those disciplines, where accountants tend to be concerned with fraud, and compliance tends to be people with a more legal approach? Is it that there is they think about things in a different way, and they can't actually work together in the same room? Is that a possibility?
I've heard it a lot, that fraud has nothing to do with money laundering, because they're looking at it two different ways. It's about stopping the money rather than looking at where the money came from or where the money's going to. Perfect example.
I see it's the same coin.
Well, the perfect example I can give you is at one company I was working with, had a merchant. The merchant was a physical flower shop. Now, card transactions going through that business showed that the flower shop was actually open about 20 hours a day, and the highest volume of its card business was actually between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. But the fraud team didn't take it any further. They just kind of looked at it and said, it's successful, what's happening? Whereas once the AML side or the compliance side got hold of it and said, there's something wrong here. There's something not right. And it did turn out that the son of the flower shop owner was doing the night duty and was actually paying for getting all the drugs paid for that he was supplying on cards under the flower shop type of business. It was looked at because at the fraud team, it was a cost center, and they were saying, we'll stop this business because we don't know what's going on. But the money laundering team looked at it and used, what I often use is absence of the normal. It didn't look normal. And that's the difference culturally between fraud and AML teams. A lot of fraud could be as a result of money laundering, or a lot of fraud will be part of the money laundering flow. I'll pass that over.
I was going to say it's an excellent example, Des. I'm going to be very brief about this. I came into the AML side of things in the early noughties before the Al-Qaeda attacks on the Twin Towers. And there's the historical role of the fraud office in banks, which has been delineated clear and been there for decades, and money laundering grew into that. And then regulators stuffed absolutely everything into money laundering, to nuclear non-proliferation, you know, hiding my mother's tea bags, all this sort of things. So there's been a growth exponential in money laundering, and it's still trying to find its way into established cultures. What I'm going to say is I don't really care who does what, as long as it works for the culture that you are in. And that could be a different social culture, a different national culture. It's whatever works for the institution. But I have a nasty feeling there's a large number of consultants with new products to sell, and they're going to label it the F word. And in the end, they'll rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic, and it will achieve almost nothing. I'm in a really positive mood this morning. Julia, how do you feel about this?
Can I just say that there is one thing that we didn't mention here, which is that several years ago there was a bid by internal audit to sit above fraud and money laundering, and to say that everything falls under us because we know the money. That thankfully failed, because internal audit also wanted to exercise an internal consultancy function, and that was going to lead to a massive conflict of interest, and eventually somebody worked that out. But it was actually there were moves made in a number of large banks around the world to put internal audit at the peak of basically anything that was financially problematic. And that is what I think, Mark, your concept of the accountants, the consultancy companies, going to come in and say, this is what needs to be done and we can do it, and look, we've got deals with these suppliers to do it. I think it's an update of that approach, and I have no hope that it will work, but I have every expectation it will cost a fortune.
The story about the flower shop that Des mentioned is really a good example that a customer profile should be looked at more holistically rather than in silo. The morning and the daytime and the night activities, they should actually be one. And to conclude, I feel that the fraud and money laundering are really two sides of the same coin, especially when it comes to the customer profile. And while I don't agree with the F word, I believe I totally subscribe to having perpetual KYC, as they call it nowadays, to have this constant perpetual knowing our customers. And this calls for collaboration between the fraud risk and compliance, reviewing the alerts generated by the systems, amalgamating the fraud and money laundering activities, or assessment risk, assessing the risk, with to identify the threats in the landscape, in order for us to be able to stay ahead. And for that, I would say also that we need to nurture a culture of continuous learning. Just because somebody is in the compliance doesn't mean that the person say, hey, I don't have to know anything about fraud. Neither should a person who specializes in fraud investigation say, this is compliance, is not my area, but it's more of a collaborative, talking about technological advancement, having the foresight to be able to enhance our ability to mitigate this risk more effectively. So that would be my take on it.
I think that's right.
what,
I think it's
Julia,
useful to point out that the currently adopted buzzword of perpetual, what did you call it? Perpetual what?
continuous.
Perpetual KYC.
KYC.
Perpetual KYC, yes. That's a stupid term to adopt, not by you, by the people that invented it, and by the people that are running around the world saying, let's do this. And the reason it's stupid is it's exactly what we're supposed to have been doing since 1994. Stop giving stuff new names to try to pretend that it's something new and novel and exciting. Just do the damn job properly from day one and stop trying to sound clever. Just be clever.
Well, then think clever as well.
Absolutely.
It may be a move on that is that quite often now over the last 2-3 years, it's being used a lot more, is the phrase is understand your client. Know your client is all about what you're doing when you're bringing them on. Understanding them during the relationship gives you a better idea of what's going on. That's the most important thing. And it is a different approach.
It is. And the important thing is that we have so far been driven by the people who are obsessed with the money, the data, who seem to think that is how to identify the stuff that's going wrong. And we have moved as far away as possible from actually knowing your customer. And that is a massive failure, both in relation to fraud and in relation to money laundering. And in relation to fraud, we are now being told, as banks, for example, that if one of our customers is defrauded, we must make good that loss. Well, I'm not going to bother with all the reasons why that's a terrible idea. But the point is, you can only do that if you know your customer, even the innocent ones.
This is where the challenge of non-face-to-face banking or onboarding becomes a huge challenge in terms of knowing our customers, because we don't know anymore. That's where I believe technology is become a gift and a curse.
So we had a slogan 20 odd years ago.
With Julia.
Yeah.
Absolutely
we had
right.
a slogan about 20 years ago, know your customer, not just his money.
That's where I think it's moved on to understand your customer, understand your client. I mean, for instance, only through the flower shop story, and I have other stories in terms of fraud that, companies talked about South American fraud, card fraud. Well, it was in a lot. They just looked at it as South American card fraud. They didn't take it any further and said, is it a facility for money laundering, or where's the money coming from or going to? However, the one thing I can take away from all this is that whenever I walk into a flower shop, I always feel like a drug dealer.
I just sneeze.
Yes.
Okay, that's we must have more stories from the OCCs. I think that the flower shop story really resonated with me. I now understand what it means by having a more holistic view of the customers. And so with that, let's over and out.
Thank you, Chairman Julia.
Thank you.
Well done.